Up from the Gates, a story of divine dealing through Dunkirk by Captain H.E. Beresford Mash. Chapter 3, The Promise Fulfilled. When I returned to my unit, a small advance party left for France at the beginning of February. Soon after, the day drew nearer for the transport section to leave with our many tons of equipment and our baggage. Concerning this, I recall a particular incident. We had an opportunity to send in advance a small amount of extra kit, but this necessitated such extra kit being sent on with the transport section and our being without it until contact was re-established on the other side. Perhaps a matter of 2 or 3 weeks. One of the items being sent in advance was one's camp bed, which, if cut back, might be turned down as being in excess of the amount allowed to proceed with the main body of the unit. My batman asked if he should pack my bed together with any other kit and sent it with the transport. I was very attached to that bed, although I was obliged to part with it abruptly in Belgium when an incendiary bomb consumed it, and I was confronted by the problem as to which of the two alternatives I should decide upon. Should I stick to the bed, then, for the sake of perhaps a fortnight's comfort, and risk not getting it across, or alternatively, should I now send it on and manage without for those 2 or 3 weeks, knowing that I should then be sure of it on the other side? Now faith has a simple answer to many of our problems. The thought came to me immediately after my batman asked me the question, if God had really said I was not going abroad, and I was convinced of this, I could not send any kit on in advance. And so I said, no, nothing is to be sent. Faith must act as if faith believed, and I was soon being put to the test. I kept back all my kit, while the others sent theirs on. A sequel, yes. I'm going to relate shortly how none of the transport proceeded abroad, and yet all the kit was left packed up for 2 or 3 weeks before it became available to its owners again. Throughout this period, I enjoyed nightly the luxury of my bed, while some were obliged to improvise their sleeping arrangements, probably laying on the right hand and sleeping that way. The pathway of faith is certainly not without its rewards, even in little things. On the 2nd of February, 2 interesting things happened. They were apparently quite unrelated. I'd felt, from my reading the previous evening, a challenge to be watchful for some incident which I felt was to happen on the coming day. The emphasis of daily light to me that night seemed to be the word tomorrow, and so I waited and watched to see what tomorrow might bring. During the morning, my own particular orderly, who had been with the unit since its inception, and was a man whose service I greatly valued for future work, came to tell me he had received orders to return his overseas equipment, to store as he would not be proceeding abroad with the unit. I discovered the reason for this later on inquiry, but such an unexpected decision at the last moment surprised me. It seemed that morning, however, to remind me that God was capable of controlling my future movement just as he willed, and that if he had said I was not going, then circumstances would be ordered by him to bring that about. I always remember how tense and expectant I felt during those last few days. I knew that somehow God was going to reverse the circumstances completely, and yet, at that 11th hour, I could not see how he could do it. Say not my soul, from whence can God relieve my care? Remember that omnipotence hath servants everywhere. His help is always sure, his methods seldom guessed. Delay will make our pleasures pure, surprise will give it zest. His wisdom is sublime, his heart profoundly kind. God never is before his time, and never is behind. J.J. Lynch. Now, when I say his, he, him, in reference to divinity, I am not calling divinity male. I'm not limiting it to some gender. But, divinity does things its way, not just because we can, form some guesses about what things are. Of course, technically, a hypothesis is an educated guess. So that happens in theology, too. The second incident occurred, quite unknown to myself, miles away at home. A letter was put through the letter box anonymously, and inside was a card bearing the following words: Faith's Amen. To God's yea. I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. Nothing shall be impossible unto you. As my wife read these words, their meaning challenged her afresh, just as I was feeling the challenge of the instant away in Devon. Greatly we were each being led to the culmination of the promise. We were being shown that God does delight to do the impossible for his children. My wife's further reaction to the message of the card that morning was to take the Lord's word literally and send a second and final thank offering to his work, believing that his promise to us had been his prophecy of a coming miracle. The following lines are full of spiritual dynamic, and I quote them because of their application to our experience at this time is so patent. We came to understand some of their depth. Faith is not working up by willpower a sort of certainty that something is coming to pass, but it is seeing as an actual fact that God has said that this thing shall come to pass and that it is true, and then rejoicing to know that it is true, and just resting because God said it. Faith turns the promise into a prophecy. While it is merely a promise, it is contingent upon our cooperation. But when faith claims it, it becomes a prophecy, and we go forward feeling that it is something that must be done because God cannot lie. Streams in the desert. In taking this next step, my wife asked for a seal from the Lord as Gideon with his fleece. This decision was reached over a banknote, and the prayer was made that a further sum might be sent through the post to complete the amount of this proposed gift to the Lord's work. Such a thing seemed almost an impossibility, humanly speaking, because any outstanding accounts from my practice had by then practically ceased to come in and were being dealt with at another address. Moreover, there were no items of that amount outstanding. Away down in Devon, early in the morning of February the 6th, our transport convoy, with all stores and equipment, moved off for the port of embarkation. The journey would occupy the entire day, but they had scarcely progressed halfway when a very unexpected thing happened. Orders had been received countering the whole move, and the police were instructed to locate the convoy and inform the officer commanding that he should contact the unit to ascertain these new orders. The convoy was located at midday passing through a town. The new orders were verified, and the party returned. Instead of being on the water that night, they were all back in their old belays by evening. Immediately I heard the news at midday. I knew that this was the development the Lord had foreseen, but of even greater interest was the development at home, where my wife had confirmation that something of this nature had occurred that day. She had received a letter from me that morning, and in the letter I had enclosed a number of business papers and letters which I wanted filed away at home, lest I should lose them. The letter reached home by the midday point, but being occupied with lunch preparations, my wife read the letter hurriedly, but did not stay to examine the enclosures. She decided to go through these at leisure in the evening. Before the day opened, my wife had been reading part of the 11th chapter of St. John's Gospel, and the key verse for the day had repeated itself again and again to her during the morning. Said I not unto thee that if thou wouldst believe, thou shouldst see the glory of God? What an application those words had to the events that day. She had still been in prayer about the money required to make up the gift, and it seemed as if this passage might have some reference to a coming answer. Now, if a person figures out their needs, then whatever, but they shouldn't. We're not asked to give from our needs in this era. When she opened and read the letter, the words of that verse were uppermost in her mind. There seemed nothing unusual in the letter, however. Yet the word was insistent. Said I not, thou shouldst see? But, Lord, I don't understand, said my wife. And immediately there came the answer in words from the same passage. Are there not 12 hours in the day? Still, she was mystified. Those words were wonderful words, and she would have understood them all if she had known what had already happened to me down in Devon, and if she had known what else there was in the letter. There are 12 hours in the day and in the evening. Going through the papers enclosed in the letter, my wife found a check. Now, back in the day, there was a lot of, no matter how long the day or night is, no matter what time of year, sunset to sunrise, 12 hours they divided it into, and sunrise to sunset, 12 hours. Unknown to her, somebody in Devon had owed me this money, and I had sent the check home asking her to pay it into our account. She had almost taken the paying in book out of the desk when, in a flash, she realized here was the money required to make up the gift. It was almost the exact amount, 4 shillings over to be exact. When praying over the matter, she had not thought of the money coming through me and was almost taken by surprise. This was God's answer, and more, it was the seal asked for, that she might know that the whole promise stood. She knew then that whatever indications pointed to the contrary, I should not be going abroad, and so the money joined the waiting note and went to the Lord's work. Was it all coincidence that that money, almost the exact amount, had been in the envelope all day? That letter reached her at midday, at the exact time at which our orders were canceled, and the transport convoy turned back from embarkation. No, God placed the seal in her hand at the very moment he honored the promise, and although she had not yet discovered she was in possession of the money prayed for as a seal, he had worked according to a perfect plan, knowing she would soon understand. He had said there are 12 hours in the day. Now, a lot of people will find a sense of secret messages in Scripture and senses of prophecy. But if the prophecy really comes from the real divinity, the God of this world and age, then it's going to be right. It's not going to be, it's more likely to be right. Because people do notice patterns, and subconsciously they will, follow along with that, even though they consciously can't figure out how they figured it out. Naturally, we only saw this in its entirety some days later. My wife did not fully understand until she learned from me what had happened. Neither did I know her side of the story until I got home again and heard it. To crown this experience, I received a weekend leave almost immediately, and at the Sunday morning service, which we attended instead of the usual opening, it was announced that, as something very exceptional had happened, it would open by everybody's present rising to sing the doxology. I felt at first the minister must have known our story, but his reference was to an outstanding answer to prayer. In the sending of a gift of several £100s for a special need, anyway, our hearts were already attuned to the doxology. I shall always remember the message of that morning. Very fittingly, it was on unbelief and was dealt with from 4 aspects. Unbelief limits God. Well, it may claim a limit on God. He did not many mighty works there because of their unbelief. Unbelief fails to appropriate. They could not enter in because of unbelief. Unbelief makes the promises void. He staggered not at the promise through unbelief. Unbelief hinders Christian service. Why could not we cast him out? Because of your unbelief. God has given me a promise, one that has appeared quite impossible of fulfillment. But he had called me to enter into it absolutely. His was the gift of faith, which shut out the impossibility, which made the promise no longer void, but pregnant, which made the promise a prophecy. While it is merely a promise, it is contingent upon our cooperation, but when faith claims it, it becomes a prophecy. And this is true, gloriously true. Not only in spiritual experience have I come to know this, but its bearing on our Christian service has been shown me also. I shall hope to refer to this in a later chapter. Now, we remember that the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation were the first New Testament texts. I mean, there's no trace of them, of any of the other ones during the 90s. And so in verse 40, it's having Jesus say to the group, "Didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe?" It's the passage about the raising of Lazarus.